So I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, I started watching Henry Louis Gates' PBS show, Finding Your Roots. Does anybody else ever watch that? I just love it. So if you haven't seen it, on the show each week, Gates interviews 2 or 3 celebrities on his each week. And most of the time, they ask Gates to track down their ancestors because they might want to learn if the stories that they heard about their past was true. And some people, I would say most people, had no idea of anybody beyond their parents or grandparents. And they're totally and completely surprised to find out all sorts of interesting things. And some hope to find the source of family misunderstandings and living arrangements. And I so look forward to seeing this show on Tuesday nights. Even if they're reruns, I'll watch them again because I like it so much. And the show is just a confirmation that life is just so complex and sometimes difficult. So watching this show made me want to check my own roots out on Ancestry. So I went on Ancestry, which is a monthly fee, and then Family Search, which is just as good, and it's free. It's run by the Mormons, and they're trying to trace everybody back to Adam and Eve. So they do a lot of good work on a quest that I don't know how useful it is. So I had some basic facts about my family. I was one of those kids that always listened in to adult conversations. And so at a very young age, I asked my family, my grandmothers, what the names of their mothers and grandmothers were so I wouldn't forget them. And I just stored them in some random part of my brain. So I had all these stories, but the best story I ever heard, and it kind of piggybacks on what Mary Rose was saying before we began Mass. The best story of all was a Protestant doctor who delivered babies in the very Catholic working class area, Port Richmond, which is where I grew up. And my grandmother, who must have been totally traumatized by this experience, she was 5 when her baby brother William was born and died. And I found his birth certificate on Ancestry, and it was clearly listed as a stillborn. But the Protestant doctor who delivered him told my great-grandmother that baby William took 1 breath, and so he was able to baptize him before he died. And because of that wonderful white lie of that wonderful doctor, baby William was able to be buried on the Catholic side of St. Anne's Cemetery. And there was another area where all the stillborn babies, as we discussed earlier, who were not lucky enough to be baptized. They were in a plot far away from their family and condemned back in the days to limbo for all eternity, deprived of any contact with their earthly family. So we know now limbo is a discredited place. Before Mass, we were talking about, Walt asked, how many people do you think are in purgatory? And of course, we all said none. But what a comfort this doctor was for all those mothers that he obviously lied to. So his name was W.B. Skull, and personally, I think he's a saint. The other thing I learned in my ancestry delving was that both of my grandmothers were pregnant before they were married. So one was born in 1884 and the other in 1905. So they were really in 2 different generations. So of course, nobody ever talked about that, at least in front of the kids. They might have all whispered in the background, but nobody talked about that. But I found their marriage licenses and I found the birth certificates of their firstborn, and they were all less than 9 months. So much for the good old day when people didn't do that sort of thing. So when you go through Ancestry, you learn other kinds of stuff. So there was my paternal great uncle Gus, who was sort of a ne'er-do-well, who in retrospect probably suffered from sort of mental health issue. And he lived in the family house with his sister, who was my grandmother, and her 8 kids. And my dad used to tell me stories about how he would go around the neighborhood and pick up cigarette butts and bring them home for Uncle Gus to smoke, because Uncle Gus never had any money. I also learned that my great-grandmother died from mitral valve prolapse, and so did her mother. And my own mitral valve began to fail when I was in my 50s. So talk about some lethal genes. So Ancestry and Family Search list the addresses of families in various censuses. And I found one part of my family in the 1840 census, which was interesting. But what I learned were these couples had like whole parcels of kids, like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 kids. And they also took in boarders in these little houses, 3-bedroom houses with no indoor plumbing. And you just have to wonder how they managed during the cold winters and the hot summers. I also found that infant and child and maternal mortality rate, the rate was extremely high. And I can't tell you how many death certificates I saw of children who died from croup, and what Dr. Skull, who was a master of all trades, what he would list as cholera, which was some sort of intestinal upset my mom used to call summer complaint. I have no idea what it is. So death was a frequent visitor in the homes of the poor during the early years of the last century. And I checked out the list of deaths at St. Anne's Cemetery in my old neighborhood, which opened in the 1840s. 90% of them who were buried there were less than 40 years old. And like COVID, which runs rampant among the poor today, the latest epidemic of diphtheria, measles, or cholera could and would destroy entire families 100 years ago. And in addition, hundreds of women and their babies died in childbirth. And yet, in spite of the predictable hardships set amidst profound tragedy, people continued to fall in love. They got married and they had children, a sign that life and love would always go on. So All Souls Day was established to honor these, our ancestors who came before us, the good, the bad, the ugly, those who taught us with life-giving stories and good example, and even those who sucked the lives out of us, and I'm sure some of us had relatives like that. And we are all a part of everything that went before us. Our ancestors did the best they could given the parameters of social and cultural constructs of the time, those constructs set within the harsh reality of bad health, both physical and mental, which people did not understand. And so here we all are today, compliments of our personal holy, or even the not so holy souls. So last weekend, in preparation to moving, I went through boxes of photos that I inherited from my mother, and I found her first communion picture, a lovely picture of her as a bridesmaid, and her high school graduation picture. And I have a portrait of my Polish grandfather and his family. His parents were one of the few to have raised all of their 12 children to adulthood. And I look at these pictures and I think, who's going to remember all this? Like all these wonderful stories, who's going to remember them? Who will remember the story of the Polish boy from Warsaw who came to Philadelphia and set up bars for 6 of his sons during Prohibition, no less? Apparently, he had his own private jail cell in the 24th Police District. And the police would go and regularly raise the bars. And my mother told me in a very embarrassed tone of voice that she remembered gin in a bathtub. And from my mother's perspective, having a father and grandfather who were engaged in illegal activities that brought the police regularly to their door was embarrassing and probably very traumatic. And I used to think it was funny. I guess I really didn't respect her experience as much as I should have. But from all that, all those traumatic experiences came growth and transformation and success for this, I guess what you would say, criminal activity. But the fact is that these old stories will surely fade away. And the other fact is that new ones will be written. And throughout this process of life-giving and storytelling, we have the blessed assurance of God's everlasting presence, which always makes all things new. That presence buoyed the spirits of our ancestors who left everything behind to come to a country that was hardly teeming with milk and honey. The intrepid nature of our ancestors lives on in us in a different way. And the new stories will be just as interesting, problematic, or exemplary. There will always be Uncle Gus's who will need extra tender, loving care and have to live in their family of origin forever. And there will always be those for whom the law is just a suggestion. Back in the day, a lot of us were taught that life on earth was a precursor for heaven, a place that we had to earn with our good behavior and unquestioning obedience. In that place, we earned through diligence and sacrifice. We would see God, and we would also see the members of our family who towed the same line we did. But you know what? I realized a long, long time ago, I think when I was a kid, that we don't have to earn an afterlife. It's always been ours for the taking, given to us by God, who would never, ever punish a divine creation for a mistake made in a short, would never punish for all eternity one mistake that was made during a short lifetime. As I said in the beginning, life is just too complicated, and there are too many extenuating circumstances over which people have little to no control. So it's easy to get lost, and only a person without pity would condemn. And we know that God loves us so much that God wants us to be happy and to live with the divine for all eternity. And that eternity would have to include those who were God to us, and that is our beloved dead. And in that afterlife, we shall all be together, our tears dried, our souls made whole and holy by the hand of that loving Mother God. I'd like to conclude with a story that I know I've mentioned before, but I think it bears repeating today as we honor our beloved dead. My grandmother died when my youngest son, Ben, was 3, and he saw my grandmother all the time. So I said to him, "Ben, where do you think Nana is?" And he looked at me and he said, "She's here. They're all here. You just can't see them." From the mouth of babes. His words made me think of the concept of the Force, if you remember the movie Star Wars. And that force has always been with us. And it has always remained undiminished by death. It is the force of love that brought us into the world, and it is the force of love that will remain when we die. As the orator Cicero wrote millennia ago, the life of the dead is placed in the memories of the living. The love you gave in life keeps people alive beyond their time. Anyone who is given love will always live on in another's heart. Or the dramatist Anton Chekhov, who wrote so beautifully, "Perhaps a person has 100 senses, and when they die, only the 5 senses that we know perish with them, and the other 95 senses remain alive." And so, my brothers and sisters, they are all here, as Ben said, in those 95 senses. Like the divine they imaged in life, they will never leave us, and we shall rest for all eternity with them, and may their force remain with us forever.